The movie begins in 1977 Wyoming, where we see a photographer, Rodney, with a woman named Sarah. They are in the middle of nowhere, and he is taking pictures of her. During this time, Sarah reveals that she is from Texas, and discusses how she and her ex-boyfriend had planned to visit all 50 states. She begins to cry as she recalls their relationship, so Rodney comforts her. She becomes uncomfortable and tries to get away. But all of a sudden, Rodney strangles Sarah, causing her to fall unconscious. He soon revives her by performing CPR, just so he can assault her while she is still conscious. The scene then cuts to Hollywood in 1978, where we meet an aspiring actress named Cheryl. During an audition, the casting director suddenly asks if she's comfortable with nudity, but she responds that she isn't. Hearing this, he doesn't seem impressed and dismisses her. Later, when Cheryl returns home, she meets her neighbor, Terry, who is also an aspiring actor. He is a bit nosy and keeps asking Cheryl about her auditions, which makes her uncomfortable. He even follows her to her apartment, where Cheryl gets a call from her manager, Helen. Here, Cheryl reveals how she's been struggling and barely has enough money to pay her rent. But Helen mentions that she has arranged for Cheryl to appear as a guest on a popular show, The Dating Game. There, she will have to blindly choose one of 3 singles and go on a date. After chatting for a bit, Cheryl wants to leave since she has work the next day. But Terry suddenly begins making advances on her, which she refuses. This rejection makes him feel bad, and Cheryl notices it. As a result, she continues to drink heavily and spends the night with him, which she regrets the next morning. The scene then cuts to San Gabriel in 1979, where we meet a homeless teenage girl named Amy, who is sleeping on a street-side bench. She then heads to a laundromat and eats some free chocolates from Valentine's Day. Afterward, she tries to steal money from a washing machine but accidentally drops all the coins. The young girl runs away and the owner tries to chase her but miserably fails. Sometime later, Amy finds a quiet spot where she begins smoking and counts her money. Just then, Rodney appears out of nowhere with his camera and starts taking pictures of her. Rodney also compliments her looks, but Amy thinks he's just messing with her. He then offers her modeling work and asks if she has done this before. Amy refuses and tries to leave, but Rodney tells her about a photography contest he's entering and wants her to model for him. He then invites her to come with him, and she agrees without hesitation. Returning to Cheryl, she arrives at the dating show and is led into the makeup chair to get ready. Moments later, the host shows up and briefs her about the show. Cheryl feels very uncomfortable, but there's no time for second thoughts. We are then taken to New York in 1971, where we see a woman named Charlie moving into her new apartment. While she is in the shower, someone rings her doorbell, but she can't hear it. Later, Charlie finds out that the moving truck has arrived with her furniture, but since her time has run out, they leave her things outside and drive away. Charlie worries about moving the furniture alone, but she soon notices Rodney in the distance taking pictures. She asks him for help, and he agrees without hesitation. After moving all of her belongings, the two sit down to drink and bond quite well. He mentions that today is his last day in the city, and feels fortunate to have met Charlie, as it is difficult to find people with whom he can connect. Hearing this, Charlie feels a bit weirded out. She then mentions that she has some things to do, and hints that he should leave. Feeling embarrassed, the psychopath asks if he can take a picture of her. But before the poor woman can say anything, he starts beating her brutally and covers her eyes before taking her picture. The scene then cuts to Cheryl, who arrives on stage as the woman of the hour while the audience cheers for her. There are 3 men behind a partition, and Cheryl can ask them anything except their name, age, and occupation. After a brief conversation, she must choose one of the men to go on a date with. Following this, the first bachelor greets Cheryl but seems very nervous and ends up mumbling a lot. Up next, the second bachelor speaks up, and he comes across as arrogant. Then, surprisingly, there's a third bachelor, who shouldn't be there, and is revealed to be none other than the psycho, Rodney. However, an audience member named Laura feels extremely terrified at the sight of him, and recalls disturbing memories from her past. But when it comes to the sweet talker Rodney, he speaks to her with charm and manages to impress the crowd. However, Laura becomes increasingly anxious upon seeing him. She informs her boyfriend that she needs to leave, but while hurrying outside, she trips over some cables interrupting the live show. The host then announces a commercial break while Laura manages to run outside. She cries in her car, thinking about memories of her late best friend Allison. Meanwhile, inside the studio, Cheryl is approached by a makeup artist who asks what's wrong, as she seems stressed. Cheryl shares that she feels uncomfortable with the stupid questions provided by the host. On the other hand, Rodney engages in a conversation with the second bachelor, who makes obscene remarks about a girl who served them coffee. He also begins to talk about Cheryl and expresses what he would do if he were to get her. However, Rodney calmly mentions that this won't happen, as he is the one who always gets the girls. In another scene, Laura is still in her car when she is approached by her boyfriend. She reveals that she knows Bachelor number 3, explaining how her friend Allison went on a date with him and was later assaulted and murdered. However, her boyfriend doesn't seem to believe her, and says that if this guy were a murderer, he would be in jail instead of on a TV show. He thinks she's still grieving for her friend and not thinking properly. Hearing this, Laura gets very upset and angrily kicks him out of the car. Meanwhile, the TV show continues, and this is when Cheryl decides to take matters into her own hands. She begins to ask her own challenging questions, which shocks the contestants. Rodney answers thoughtfully and shows that he respects women. Meanwhile, Laura arrives in the back room and finds a security guard there. She tells him that she wants to talk to the producer about something very important. She reveals that last year, her friend was assaulted and murdered by a man who is now a contestant on the show. Returning to the show, Cheryl asks Rodney if the other contestants talked about anything disgusting backstage. Rodney gladly reveals that Bachelor number 2 had some thoughts about bra sizes being a prerequisite for a meaningful relationship. Hearing this, everyone is stunned, so the host begins to freak out and calls for a commercial break. Elsewhere, the security guard asks Laura to wait in a room. Back on set, Bachelor number 2 argues with Rodney for revealing what he said during the show. He asks for Rodney's contact information so they can confront each other after the show ends. But instead of giving his details, Rodney hands him a picture of a woman who is beaten and tied up. The show resumes, and it's finally time for Cheryl to choose her date. She ends up choosing Bachelor number 3, the only one who seems reasonable and respectful toward women. The host then reveals the identities of the 3 men Cheryl hasn't met. While she is hugging each of them, Bachelor number 2 whispers in her ear and asks her to be careful with the man she chose. The host congratulates Cheryl and Rodney on their all-expense-paid trip to Carmel, California. On the other hand, we see that Laura is still waiting in the room, and it finally dawns on her that the security guard didn't believe her story and was just messing with her. Meanwhile, the show finally ends, but on the way out, she unexpectedly runs into Rodney, who has been waiting for her. They then chat for a while, and he invites her out for a drink, which takes Cheryl by surprise. In another scene, we see Amy and Rodney driving down a desolate road. She then takes his photo album and becomes fascinated by the various pictures he has taken over the years. However, Rodney closes the book and asks about her life. Amy doesn't share much, so the man quickly figures out that she's a runaway. As the sun begins to set, Rodney parks the car in a secluded spot and starts taking her pictures. He then makes her stand at the edge of a cliff and face the sun. The girl innocently obliges. But then, all of a sudden, returning to Cheryl, she ends up going to a bar with Rodney. She then recalls Bachelor 2's words and feels increasingly scared. Following this, the two exit the bar, and Rodney says he will walk with her to her car. On the way, he asks for her number so they can connect later. Rodney suddenly asks her to repeat the number to ensure he has the right one. In the end, she admits that she doesn't want to see him and begins to leave. She then rushes toward her car, but the perverted psychopath doesn't give up and continues to follow her. Cheryl is aware of this, and when she tries to get into her car, fortunately, several people arrive at the parking lot, forcing the pervert to walk away. The next day, Laura arrives at the police station with the help of her boyfriend. Meanwhile, Cheryl is packing her belongings to finally leave Hollywood, as she has been traumatized enough. In the next scene, Amy wakes up with her hands tied after being brutally beaten and assaulted by Rodney. She notices him crying inconsolably next to her. Realizing she has no way to escape, she decides to gain the psychopath's trust by pretending that everything is fine. Amy then asks him to do her a favor and keep what happened a secret, claiming she would be embarrassed by others' judgment. She also asks him to untie her so they can head to his place. Hearing this, Rodney believes her, so he unties her and proceeds to take her home. In the car, he apologizes for being rough, and Amy assures him that everything is okay. They then proceed to drive away and soon come across a truck on the road. But Amy doesn't shout or ask for help, so Rodney feels relieved. Shortly after, the two arrive at a gas station, where Rodney leaves Amy alone in the car to go to the washroom. When Rodney returns from the restroom after cleaning up, he doesn't see Amy anywhere, which surprises him. Soon enough, the police arrive while Amy watches from a nearby diner with tears in her eyes. In the final scene, we learn that the movie is based on the actual events surrounding a serial killer named Rodney Alcala. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.